This is such a fascinating book.
Thank you so much.
I really appreciate the balance you strike of history and analysis and sort of um, even I don't know if I'd call it memoir, but personal history.
Yeah, no,
Um,
I think that's very fair to think
yeah,
of it in those terms.
it could at any point it could sort of teeter too far in one direction or another, but I feel like you really balance a lot of elements here,
Thank
all in the
you.
service of this sort of larger argument.
Well,
Um,
thank you so much.
about kind of as you say, a new philosophy of opera and a realignment of
Yeah.
its, I mean, I guess if I were to boil it down, I'd say a realignment of its relationship with the public,
Mm,
um,
that's nice.
and sort of like what is this really? What is this art form?
Right.
Um, and
No,
it's
that's
funny.
exactly right. Yeah, exactly right.
Well, I'm glad you agree with that. I was going to ask you to take issue with my characterization.
No, no, no. Like I was really, when I wrote the book, I really wanted to write a something that would feel like a 360-degree book that was not just, like I'm trying to look from chapter to chapter. Oh, something just popped up. Excuse me. Uh, Meetings being, yeah. Yeah. I really wanted to look at like the opera from a 360-degree perspective, that it was not the kind of monolith that we often are told that opera is, where the producing of an opera, the work itself, the experience of opera is all completely fused together. But instead, to take all of those elements apart and realize that those are a lot of different aspects of what opera is. So the experience of opera is one I talk about quite a bit in terms of my first time going to the opera, or the experience of seeing an opera in a moving vehicle, for example. So like that's one aspect of it. Then there's, the practical side of the making of an opera, and the interpretation of opera, what goes along with that, and then also the social and political kind of ramifications of what it means to represent people on stage, and where opera fits on
Hmm.
that continuum. And in each and every one of those questions, I think there's like an assumed knowledge of what opera is that I think is contrary to what the potential opera can be, might look, what the future of the art form really might look like. And so, in some respects, the book, by talking about all those different elements, I hope it offers readers a language for really understanding what opera might be, as opposed to what they might imagine opera is. Because I think
Yeah.
we know that opera is stuck with a lot of baggage in terms of what the expectations are. Yeah.
Right.
So
Yeah, when I think about your methodology with the book, I almost envision like you're holding this thing and flaking the crust off of an understanding, because you really bring us early in the book to the origins of this art form,
yeah,
and sort of remind the reader like what a radical tradition this is,
absolutely.
and how outlandish the ambitions are at its core, and really sort of put that in opposition to centuries of received wisdom and orthodoxy and convention. And
Right.
um, I mean, has that raised hackles in the operatic world or in the modern
I mean,
world?
I think it's so interesting because, I think I'm always having the hardest time connecting with people who are really deep in the wool opera lovers, because they tend to have decided what opera is for them. And often it can be something that to me feels somewhat partial. So it's like the thing that they really love the most is just the music, And so they'll say when they go to the opera, but they just go and close their eyes and just listen to the music. And I think, well, that then, like it's not really what opera's about, for example. Or, people that love going to the opera because they kind of imagine it as a throwback to an old era, and, an opportunity to kind of experience the world the way it was in the 18th century. And it also, for me, feels pretty antithetical to the notion
Mhm.
that opera is constantly being reborn each and every time that you do it. And so it carries with it the fingerprints of our own time. And I think instead of trying to hide those fingerprints, I think those fingerprints need to be very apparent in the making of the opera.
Right.
So I again, like the people that really feel like they have opera figured out for them, I think that's great. No issue. I have no issue with that, other than to say, this book might require a little bit of an open mind if that's how you are, if that's your
Right.
perspective. But I think I'm really trying to write for people who might be really interested in what opera could be about and are looking for a way in. In which
Mhm.
case, I think I hope the book offers many, many ways in.
Do you feel like, um, events of the last decade or so, within, the world of opera and opera companies,
Mhm.
um, has it been bending towards this vision? Like, do you feel that this is a really receptive moment for this message?
I do. I do mostly because of COVID. I really get the sense that COVID has required all of us to really make the case for opera each and every time we produce it, as opposed to kind of taking it for granted. And so I think it's a really opportune moment to really think about the essentials of opera and what do we think opera is based on handed down ideas versus what could it really be. And so yes, I do think certainly the work I've been doing here in Detroit has been really trying to push that dialogue further. And it's I've been here for 4 years now. I'm just it's at the beginning of my fifth season, and it's really great to see how that's a process, and that the audience is really evolving into appreciating a different kind of opera. I had somebody come to see our Traviata, which is actually, probably the first production since I've been artistic director that is more on the traditional side in terms of storytelling, but very well told. But
Mhm.
still, like, I mean, it's not in reverse order. It's not in another time period. It's not cut up. It's like, it's pretty, in that sense, pretty traditional. But since we haven't done something like this, it's really refreshing for a lot of people instead of it just being taken for granted. And I had one of our staff members came up to me and they said, "Well, we're really Yuval opera people, and so this took us a little bit of getting used to this kind of." I was like, "Oh, that's very cool." So
Right.
anyway, it's been exciting to see that in a city like Detroit, where the operatic diet's been pretty narrow. It's been great to see that it just takes a commitment to a different way of doing things, to really bring people on board. I'm sure Anthony in Philadelphia is going to achieve similar results. And, I look at what the Met is doing now, with so much emphasis on new opera, which is so exciting. And I do think since, in the intervening years, there has been more and more of an emphasis on the theatrical side of things. And I think that's been great for the conversation around opera. So
Right.
yes, I do think I think in general, maybe if this book came out 20 years ago, it might have been a more foreign or alien thing. But I hope that it's out now as the overall zeitgeist is kind of ready to rethink some of these assumptions.
Yeah. Well, I'll give you one case study, which is
Okay.
Missy Mazzoli and Royce
Oh yeah.
Fitzpatrick's The Listeners, which we just saw here. And I attended rehearsals and spoke with
Oh, did
them.
you?
And
Okay, great.
so I really kind of, immersed in the production a bit. But it also coincided with Anthony's, assuming the helm and
Exactly.
his new pricing initiative, in
Right.
which
Right.
every seat was available for as low as $11. And
Right.
so it was a really fascinating thing to witness. First of all, these excited full houses.
Right.
And Anthony,
Great.
on the first night, he asked the audience, how many of you are here seeing opera for the first time? And it was a pretty substantial number of people in the hall who cheered and applauded,
That's wonderful. That's
And so
really
then to
wonderful.
see the, the nature of that opera, which really does lean into the theatrical,
Yes.
Liliana Blaine Cruz and
Yes, she's such a
this
great director. We had her here in
fantastic
Detroit too.
set
Yeah.
design, production design, these um, in a way that really serves the story. It was very cool to see because people were kind of riveted. It was an edge
Amazing.
of the seat sort of experience. Um, and it felt, the phrase of yours that popped to mind around this whole
Mm.
thing was the notion of an anti-elite
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
you know,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
this story with its, very relatable, like sort of exotic and yet familiar contemporary milieu, and the
Right.
cult element, and the Royce's libretto, which is full of, just like regular speech.
Mm-hmm.
It all
Absolutely.
felt like, oh, like if I were to think about a manifestation of Yuval's anti-elitist opera, like this actually does fit the bill.
Amazing. I'm so sad I didn't see it in Philadelphia, but I plan to see it in Chicago. And
Yeah.
we did Missy and Royce's Breaking the Waves last season, so
Mm.
it's been exciting to see how exactly what you said, that something about how approachable the piece is, how direct the work is,
Yeah.
and I have to say, I mean, I haven't seen the listeners, but I was so impressed by how Missy and Royce also really captured, a key feature of opera for me that I talk about a lot in the book is how ambiguity functions in opera. And they
Right.
they manage to make ambiguity a sensuous pleasure,
Yeah. Right.
which is very challenging, but to me is the core of what opera is all about. And I just think the world of them, and I'm so glad. I'm so glad this worked out. I'm also very curious how Anthony's gambit with pricing is going to play out over the next few years. I mean, I think it's a
Yeah.
great signal to send to people. And I nevertheless hope that people that came for the first time and only paid $11, I hope they realize what a great gift that was for them. Because, like, those, if those tickets cost what the opera actually cost to produce, like,
Right.
then we would be talking about a very elite art form. But I will say that actually, even in Detroit, our ticket prices, we don't have $11 tickets, but we have tickets as low as $25. And our top ticket is 145. Now, 145 may on the surface sound maybe like a lot, but I just went last night or 2 nights ago here in Detroit to Stevie Wonder, and $145 would not have gotten you in the door. And not a
Yeah.
single person is going to say that the Stevie Wonder concert was elitist or exclusionary.
Right.
So
Right.
there's something, the price point is a factor, but I think it's going to be all of it. I think it was great that Anthony started this with the listeners as something that was new and different and direct, like you said. So I'll just be curious how we go every direction in every path that we can to try and express to people that this is engaging material and there are no barriers to your appreciation or inclusion in what's happening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're all very fascinated to watch. I
Yes,
think
I'm
Anthony
sure.
himself is, very keen to see how this is going to turn out. He
Yes, I'm
himself describes
sure.
it as an experiment.
It is.
Um,
It's a great experiment. I'm very excited to see how it plays out. Yeah.
now a lot of what you're known for is, you know, experimentation with form. And
Yes, I
by
love
that
the
I
I love the
mean,
operatic form. I mean,
yeah,
I
and
like the operatic
the
form.
experimentation is everything from sequence, like
Yes,
running the last act first and that kind of thing.
right. Yeah,
But also form, meaning like, um, presenting things outside of a hall, out on the
right.
streets, in moving vehicles, like in a parking lot, this kind of thing. Um,
Absolutely.
and so that uh, clearly presents one sort of mode of reinvention for this art form, formal experimentation. And then there's another thing, which is like taking the traditional, like let's say that the Met Opera, where you have experience, and a lot has.
Not yet, but it's coming
Well, yes,
soon.
you've been
Coming
commissioned.
soon.
You've been commissioned
Yes, that's
to,
right.
to take some of the most, this is a ring cycle, so this is like kind
Right.
of the Valhalla, right?
That's absolutely right. Yeah.
Um, but it's interesting to think about that other thing, which is like, okay, so the Met Opera, it is going to be the Met Opera no matter what,
It's true. Yeah.
and there's a certain grandeur and a certain scale. Um, but I was at so I've seen both of Terence Blanchard's operas there. And at opening night of Fire Shut Up in My Bones, it was really electric to just sort of take stock of who was in the hall,
Oh, sure.
how they felt about being there.
Yeah.
Just this
Yeah.
like very wild sense of like we here, like that we
Totally.
are telling our stories in this space, and it is for us at this moment, and it was
Exactly.
a real long journey to that. And so, could you talk about that element of
Yes,
it as well? Like who is opera for and who
I
can it
know.
be?
So great. It's such a great question. And it's a question that's still evolving, which is so wonderful, and it's why I believe so much in the idea that opera is a continually expanding art form. Because as we all know, opera was originally for aristocracy. That was the art form grew in a very, very elite and exclusionary context. But it wasn't long before, and I talk about this a bit in the book, it wasn't long before opera became this kind of Janus figure that had, on one hand, the aristocratic elite audience, Monteverdi's Orfeo, for a very, very small public, in a room that was really quite narrow and quite, very few theatrical possibilities in that little room that it took place in, from what we know about what happened. But I mean, less than 50 years later, um, competing theaters in Venice are vying for public audience, and opera as a commercial entertainment that rose and fell based on popular interest, then opened up a whole new possibility for what opera is, right? And so
Yeah.
within 50 years of its birth, we automatically have this, in a way, tension that I think is still with us, which is who is opera for, to your question, and the possibility that actually it can be for anybody based on how it's produced and based on who's producing it and
Mhm.
what's the subject matter and how accessible is this, how close to contemporary politics are we really going to dare to go, for example? So Monteverdi's last opera that survives, I mean, many of his operas didn't survive, but there's Orfeo on the one hand, which is the earliest surviving opera, and then there's Coronation of Poppaea. So half of what we'll be doing at Curtis is one of the few remaining that's few kind of public operas that still exists.
Mhm.
And you see in that range, but first of all, the two pieces together, when you compare them, they're so very different. And the Poppaea clearly inviting the audience into a political satire, which must have had contemporary resonance that we can only kind of academically understand, maybe,
Right. Mhm.
but makes for part of the power of Poppaea kind of challenging when you do Poppaea again. And that led us to Come Poppaea, which maybe we'll get to during this conversation, or we'll see.
Yeah. Yeah.
But in any case, um, you know, um, so I think that, Monteverdi absolutely knew he was writing for a kind of everyday kind of audience, potentially, with Poppaea, which he was not doing for Orfeo. And so
Mhm.
he knew that the audience was different. Now, that's all Italy. Okay, that's all like origin of opera time. Here we are now in America. We've inherited all these operas. We still do them, right? Sometimes we do them with what I think of as a kind of false sense of duty to their original ideas, because our context is completely different. So for me, I don't totally understand why we would do these operas exactly the way they were done. And also, in most cases, we don't really know how they were done, but we have
Mhm.
assumed traditions that we just keep passing on from one generation to another. But in America, we have, in addition to that, we have this notion of who is included in the storytelling, who is included and invited into the participation of this art form. And I think we all know that unless it is as diverse of an art form as, in many ways, opera has diversity in its DNA because of its hybrid nature, because of it being music, drama, fashion, design, like there's so poetry, all of these things, no single artistic voice having dominance, but instead
Right.
finding a way to cohere. There's something about that for America, it makes it it only makes sense if we're also opening up the notion of diversity of story, or diversity of interpreter, diversity of perspective. I think that what we have been seeing in the last few years, with that proliferation of new voices in opera, to me, it feels so natural for opera, because opera is already inherently a hybrid kind of genre.
Yeah.
So I've been finding that incredibly exciting to see opera get closer and closer to what it means to be American, and that my book is very focused on opera in America. I don't
Yeah.
talk a lot about opera in Europe. I mean, I do have the stories, some of my stories of working in Europe, but I'm really focused on opera in America with all of its challenges and all
Right.
of its potential.
So that raises an interesting point for me, which is that, the American cultural apparatus is
Yeah.
so geared towards stars, towards like exceptional individual
Yeah.
accomplishment, right?
Well, theater
Um,
is too, like
yeah,
the
right.
not
But
yeah.
so we're
Yeah.
we're speaking on the day that this Netflix actually just 2 hours ago posted a new trailer
Ah,
for Maria, for their Maria
oh,
Callas.
I can't wait to
Um,
see this.
and
Oh, it's coming out in theaters first, though.
it's going to be in theaters in November and then on Netflix in December. And the
Got
trailer,
it.
of course, is very sumptuously made.
Yes,
Um,
as I'd expect.
and Angelina Jolie looks like she's on a fast track to a Best Actor,
Right.
this win, quite possibly. But there's a moment in the trailer, where she, is speaking, I think in response to a question, perhaps, and she
Mm.
says, "My life is opera. There is no reason in opera." This like with this hauteur,
Yes, yes.
so all of this, I saw this literally an hour before we connected, and I thought
Funny.
I have to bring this up because it seems to me that in your formulation in this book, like you are, if not anti-diva, you are sort of indifferent to the like veneration of the diva. And the fact that this is the metric by which most people think about, they think about like when you say the word opera in America, people think Caruso,
Of
or they think
course.
Alice, or they think, insert name here.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's talk about that for a minute, like this sort of individual
It's
lowest.
such a great question. Yeah, really, really great question. I Oh, how do I say this? So okay, so I do have a chapter in the book that's really about singers. I think it's natural. Every time I tell people I'm an opera director, and they say, "Oh, you must sing too." Like they just assume, because it's opera, that
Right.
anyone involved in opera also sings. So I say, no, 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 I'm a terrible singer. I leave that to the experts. I want to leave, let me leave that to the people that really do that well. But so there's I think, like everything in opera, part of what's so wonderful but also so challenging about it is there's a John Cage word for his methodology that I think is so appropriate for opera in general. His operas, the Euro operas, are to me like the perfect operas in so many ways. But there's a word that he came up with that connects those operas with the rest of his work, which is interdependence.
Mm.
And I love that word because it implies you can't be independent in opera. You can't be just your own person. That's also the danger of the diva, actually, is that it's only about the kind of star tour to star turn, and not about how that diva or divo, if we want to gender it, but we don't need to. But anyway, but if we, like that can sometimes tip the balance of opera into a direction that no longer becomes about interdependence, right? Like, and also you're still dependent on everybody else too. But if everyone's only dependent and doesn't have personality and doesn't bring themselves to it, then you just have a kind of slavish dependence on each other. And that's not interesting either, right? So you have these two extremes, dependence and independence. And Cage came up with the word interdependence. And that to me is opera. And in the end, divas have a hard time being interdependent. and so that again, that's the danger. But I also, of course, adore the singers that you just feel like they have an artistry that's so individual to who they are. And Maria Callas for sure is one of those people. And I mean, I never saw her, so I don't know, I can't say that, her presence always tipped the scale so far in the direction of just her. I mean, when I listen to her recordings, there's some of them just feel like she found a way to unlock the character and the emotions and the music in a way no one else did. But I don't know if maybe on stage she just sucked up all the oxygen herself and didn't leave any room for anybody else. That might be the case. And again, that's, for me, it's conjecture because I didn't experience that myself. But I did, when I wrote the book, I did feel like, I wonder if I can write a book that doesn't actually that doesn't go into the adulation of Maria Callas, an adoration of Maria Callas, because I feel like that does get in the way of trying to explain the crazy, messy hurly-burly that opera really is. And so the people that I highlight, the singers that I highlight, and Maria Callas does appear briefly in the book, but but she's not featured anywhere near as heavily as Valtraud Meyer, who's an artist who absolutely, to me, exemplifies that notion that it's like she is truly one of the greatest singing actors I have ever seen on stage, and it's always about the work, and it's always about her colleagues, and it's always about the production, in a way. But she doesn't disappear at all. Like, I mean, she really comes to the fore. So for me, I spent a lot of time in the book talking about her and also talking with her, because I wanted to give her a chance to speak with her own voice, the way that I would like to see singers have that kind of personality, but not at the expense of anybody else. And that is possible, but it's challenging. So then, after Maria Callas, there were plenty of divas that kind of went in her direction and certainly did tip the balance. But I will say, as I look at the operatic landscape, like I'd love to see more of those kind of singers that really do have a personality that absolutely make you say, I'm so curious how she or he interprets this particular role,
Right.
Just maybe not as a solo act,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it is interesting, the way that you're talking, when I think about Callas, and who knows, maybe the movie actually does well with this.
Could be, absolutely.
But it's like you think about this, spectacular talent, and then, hopefully, ideally, one of the questions you ask is, well, what is the system that so perfectly spotlighted this talent? Like, how was opera as a tradition, an art form, a cultural machinery, how was that so effective in taking what she did well and like putting it on this pedestal, if that system didn't exist, would she have become the star that she did?
Totally. I mean, I can't wait to see it. I mean, I'm really excited to see it. Obviously, it's going to be a major, it'll be pretty major to see how opera's depicted. I mean, it's been interesting to see how classical music and opera has appeared. I talk about this also in the book somewhat, like how it's found its way into popular culture. There's ways in which it is a kind of stand-in for elegance and conspicuous consumption and all of these things related to capitalism, and I don't like that at all. But there are, so it'll be interesting to see how someone like Maria Callas is depicted, and if it feels like it's the kind of piece that people will just be so excited to well, maybe from there people will really be interested in going to the opera. Well, that would be a great thing to come out of this movie.
Yeah, well, exactly, right. If it's not just her recordings that trend on Spotify, but it actually results in something else.
That's right.
So yeah, let's turn to Comet Popea, because I have questions.
I'm sure you do. It's a very confusing project.
It feels like, so as I'm reading your book, I'm nodding and I'm thinking, oh, there is such a great, push towards sort of accessibility and welcome and inclusion. And when I look at the Comet Popea on paper, I'm like, this is so high concept. and it feels very like intellectually
Mm,
rooted.
mm.
But I know that when I experience it, I'm going to have a very different sort
Yeah,
of response.
yeah,
And so I'd love to hear your thoughts about like how did you conceive of this pairing?
sure.
Um, and
Yeah.
yeah, let's talk about that.
Well, I mean, to your hesitation, because I actually I get this a lot with my projects, which is like, I really care about accessibility and engagement, and but for me, none of that has to do with a piece being watered down. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? And in the book, I have a quote that was very, for me, really spoke to how I thought about opera, which is by Simone Weil, the French philosopher, talking about how actually, we don't need to water down quote unquote high culture so that that people that don't have experience with it um, can possibly engage. In fact, like all we have to do is translate it to so that it's legible to the heart, is what she describes, and it's in a way that's so beautiful. And I completely believe that actually the average audience member is able to comprehend much more than we give them credit for, and we often within opera are so worried about its potential irrelevance that we can often water things down and make it on the surface seem relevant, and by doing so, maybe take away all of the flavor of what makes it actually a meaningful opera. So I mean, we did Comet Epopeia in Los Angeles, and I do have to say that it was, a wide range of audience reactions, and maybe on paper it might seem a challenging piece to engage with if you're only reading the marketing materials. But I do know people that were sitting with the piece and understand it and just in the piece with us. I think they found a lot of potential meaning from it, beyond any quote unquote intention that any of us
Mhm.
might have had, and that
Right.
to me is so crucial.
Yeah.
Is thinking through that. So sorry. So that was one part, but the pairing really emerged because Anthony Roth Costanzo wanted me to do just Popea, and I actually really resisted doing an opera that felt like it was only about an emperor behaving badly. This was 2018. So we had a lot of of wannabe emperors behaving badly in our culture, and I just did not want to do that in the opera world. And instead, I thought to myself, how about how about relativizing that with the story of a different kind of social mobility is potentially. I mean, Popea is ultimately about social mobility of the one character trying to become empress. And so I thought, well, how does that resonate with other stories that might be contemporaneous or closer to contemporaneous? And it was in talking to George Lewis that we decided on The Comet by Du Bois, because it allowed us to really be a commentary on exclusion in classical music more broadly, and that pieces like Popea enact a certain exclusion,
Mhm.
uh, include especially in America, which just made us want to say let's balance that idea
Yeah.
with stories of like, how do we get past this? How do we get past the notion of opera as exclusionary and
Mhm.
closed and finished?
Yeah.
And that led to kind of this tessellation of these two pieces. And very early on, it was very clear to me, okay, these are going to be two operas happening simultaneously on a rotating stage, and the audience on either side of the stage is
Uh-huh.
going to see part of it, and you're going to have to kind of let your imagination fill in the blanks from what seems to be happening on the other side. You'll be able to hear everything. What you hear in relation to what you see is going to be totally dependent on where you're sitting. And I
Yeah.
find that's a kind of mode of spectatorship that I've been very excited about, and does underline a lot of the thoughts in the book. So
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
had somebody who read the early galley of the book and then came to see Comet Popea in Los Angeles, and they said, "Well, this is the perfect crystallization of everything you're talking about in the book."
Oh,
So
that's very exciting. Yeah. No,
yeah, so I can't wait to hear your thoughts on it and see if you agree.
yeah, the experiential note that you're describing feels very, resonant
Yeah,
with what you write about.
yeah.
Well, let me ask about about George Lewis's contribution, because
Sure.
I'm really familiar with his work as an
Oh, you are.
improviser and a computer, a pioneering, computer music person. I've
Mm.
actually seen a staged version of his AACM opera at
Oh,
Ojai.
you saw that.
Um,
Okay, great.
and George is he's such a, enormous thinker
Oh,
and
I know.
conceptualizer.
He's
His
so great.
music can be a little like, it can present some challenge,
Yeah, for
like in
sure.
terms of points of entry. And so
Absolutely.
I'm really curious to hear how this sounds, and whether he engages with the Monteverdi language or just completely diverges from it. Like, can you speak to that at all?
Yes, I can. I mean, he did he really did, um, yeah, okay. So it's, God, we developed this piece over 6 years, so there's like, that was a long gestation process.
Yeah.
I think how he originally decided to engage with the Popea, Douglas Kearney, who wrote the libretto, really got involved in the dramaturgy of Popea and tried to look at ways in which the poetry from Monteverdi's librettist might find echoes and resonances in the language of the comet. I think that George's approach was thinking about music, thinking about the structure being a bit more modular so that there was the opportunity for interruptions, starting and stopping. I think he knew that it's not a piece for him to be precious. And that's the attitude he brought with him to this. And, Joel, you might have seen Joel, who sang in also the AACM
Mhm.
opera as well.
I think
I
so,
mean,
yeah.
she approached this music. I mean, she got this music and she said, "Well, this is the most tonal music, George, that I've ever sung of yours." So, like,
Uh-huh.
he really wrote a very different piece. I don't know. I think he would have to explain how much I wouldn't want to put words in his own mouth about like how much the Monteverdi in the end influenced him, but I think what influenced him probably more than anything was just this notion that he's in a kind of he's almost making an exquisite corpse with Monteverdi,
Yeah.
because he didn't know 100% which scenes might appear when. He couldn't anticipate that the audience would necessarily hear one particular thing. So where was he going to introduce ideas of repetition and revision throughout the piece? So yeah, so I think it was a kind of constant, but maybe not active dialogue partner, but just I think he was always aware of it. And I think when he thought about the timbres of the orchestra, I think he definitely had the harpsichord in mind as a kind of contrary voice. That then he, of course, also then wrote a virtuosic scene for it. But
Yeah.
no spoilers.
Yeah. Well, this is all very exciting. And it's especially exciting because it's right around the corner. So,
I know you
like,
get to, I mean, and I myself, it's such a busy period for me that I am not I haven't been able to be there very much. But I started with them and will and be there on Monday to see the rehearsals from Monday
oh,
on.
great.
So, yeah.
Now you also, um, and this will be kind of our home stretch of this interview. Thank you so much, by the way,
Oh,
for
it's my
being so
pleasure.
generous with your time.
Oh, no, it's fine.
Um, Political resonances and cultural
Oh,
resonances,
yeah.
this is something that you very much take into account, as you've said, like sometimes steering away from the obvious. Um, in the case of the comet, there is a really, interesting dialogue, obviously, about race, and then
Yeah.
also this kind of post-apocalyptic
Yes.
meditation, which has, scarily, it has a lot of relevance for us today. I think,
Agreed.
what was purely conjectural in the sort of sci-fi landscape, like, I think we all think about apocalypse,
Oh, for sure. I
today,
mean, everywhere. It's hard to
yeah.
avoid right now.
So, can you talk about your thought process there in terms of releasing this into the world at this stage in history,
Well, I mean, what really is crazy is that when Du Bois wrote the Comet short story, it was it was inspired by, it was written in 1920, and as a response to the last global pandemic, the Spanish influenza. And it led him to also be thinking about end times and,
Mhm.
but from a really specifically racial perspective of, will it take a kind of global pandemic to eliminate racism? You know, and the short story, the way that the short story ends gives you the impression, no, actually, even that is not going to be enough, So it's very, George talks about it a lot as a early forerunner of Afro-pessimism, this particular story. When we started exploring it, we did not, the libretto was done before COVID hit, right? So this was all in motion, and it was all done prior to George Floyd being murdered and Breonna Taylor being murdered. And, it's like, that's this notion that, we knew when we brought in Du Bois, we were going to start talking, and George as well, and Douglas, we all wanted to talk about race and exclusion in classical music. And in many ways, the piece began as a kind of institutional critique of opera as exclusionary and an allegory for that in many ways.
Yeah.
So, we did not anticipate that the piece would, end up feeling so resonant with things that were just about to happen. Now, it took 4 years before we actually produced it, but in many ways feels like the timing is really right, because I think now the public conversation around race and end times and all of this kind of stuff, and the relevance of our old institutions. One of the things that happens in Popea is that the philosopher Seneca is forced to commit suicide, and in many ways, it's such a clear allegory for the notion that old ways of thinking and old philosophies that organized our culture are no longer valid, and are forced to commit some kind of suicide, and that feels so resonant too, with our time. And so, yeah, I mean, like anything, I think I mentioned this in the book, but if I don't mention it directly in the book, I'm always so fascinated by the notion that, you start these projects with a real sense of just following some sense of intuition. And then before you know it, you're responding to all of these invisible forces around you,
Right.
and sometimes not so invisible forces around you. And I think in that case, like, this piece feels like a very honest expression of what we've all been thinking the last 5 years.
Well, thank you again, and hopefully I will see you in a couple weeks.
Thank you so much. Look forward to seeing you soon.
Thanks again, Yuval.
Take care. Thanks.